the Army was conducting tests with LSD. And so when MKUltra got going, they were trying to do a whole bunch of different things. One of the scientists who worked on this program, they took LSD themselves because they wanted to understand its effects and how to do it. And so Frank Olson was in that group, and there's one common misconception that that he was unwittingly dosed. He may have been, but other times he, like the other scientists,
he took it himself.
Took the LSD to try and figure it out. But what became clear in Olson's case was that he knew that they were experimenting on human subjects with the LSD, and he wanted to withdraw from the program. He just wanted to quit. So that's when they were accompanying him to New York. And when he was in New York, he fell from the window. I think what happened was he was trying to leave the hotel room, and a brawl ensued, and in the brawl, he was thrown out the window.
Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Chicho, and today I'm honored and excited to be joined by none other than Jefferson Morley. Let me tell you about this incredible individual and what he's been up to. So Jeff is an editor, he's an investigative reporter, and he's an awesome author. He's a Washington-based journalist whose books tell untold stories of American power and corruption. He comments for publications on news about the CIA, national security, and the assassination, particularly about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which for those of you who have been with me for a while already know why I have such an interest in this man. He is also the editor of the JFK Facts blog, which is on Substack, and he is the vice president of the nonprofit Mary Ferrell Foundation, and that's a sponsor of the largest collection of searchable JFK assassination records on the internet. I should also mention that none other than Glenn Greenwald has stated that Jeff is one of the world's leading journalists investigating JFK and what happened on that fateful day. For those of you who don't know who Greenwald is, he's a pretty renowned and award-winning American journalist, author, patriot, former lawyer who, among many of his deeds, became noted for his exposure of U.S. and British global surveillance programs, which were based on Snowden's leaks. So without further ado, I mean, we're going to talk. Jeff has some incredible books, but I could spend the next 5 minutes talking about them, but I want to get into the questions with him. Thank you so much for beaming in, Jeff. Great to have you, man.
Thanks for having me, Faust. Thanks for that introduction. And fire away.
Okay.
I think you know my work, so we can delve into kind of whatever you want.
Definitely. There's so much, man. We may have to do a sequel, but so I talk about this man. He's not so much at the forefront, but he ran the CIA's deepest operations, and he helped build the American surveillance state that we are currently living in. He waged psychological warfare on his own country, and he blatantly lied to Congress about what he knew in the aftermath of JFK's assassination. So my question for you, my friend, is how did James Jesus Angleton become the most powerful spymaster America ever knew? Or I should say never knew.
I mean, that description's a little hyperbolic, but not by much. He was an extraordinarily powerful man in the CIA for 20 years, from 1954 to 1974. You said a founding father of the surveillance state we live in. That's accurate. He instituted a massive mail surveillance program in the 1950s, which over 20 years probably intercepted 200,000 different letters mailed by Americans. All of this with no probable cause, no presidential authorization, just on his own and the CIA's whim. So, these days people don't rely on letters so much because we have emails and phone calls and all of that. But, at a time when people did a lot of personal communications by letter, the CIA was massively spying on Americans in a way, illegal way. And that was James Angleton's idea. He was a very precociously smart young man, had grown up in international circumstances in the 30s and 40s. His father was a self-made millionaire, and he grew up in Milan, Italy. He went to Yale and then Harvard Law School, and then went into intelligence work during World War II. He joined the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime intelligence agency of the United States during World War II. And after the war, the OSS kind of morphed into
CIA, right?
what became the Central Intelligence Agency. So when the Central Intelligence Agency was founded in 1947, Angleton was already sort of a star of the U.S. intelligence service, and he rose rapidly in the ranks of the CIA to the point where he was one of the 2 or 3 most, powerful men in that agency. And the 1950s were really, the heyday of the CIA. They had complete impunity, total support from the press.
They don't have that now?
So Angleton was a leading figure in that first generation of CIA officers whose influence is still felt.
Right. He was a bit of a ghost here in America, but it was fascinating for me to learn that in Israel, they knew exactly who he was. He has like 2 memorials there, one right inside of Mossad headquarters, and a forest planted in his name. So it begs the question, did he have divided loyalties? And given that JFK was locked, we know there was a lot of beef between JFK and this battle he was kind of internally having over Israel and nukes, right? So my question is, what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, a couple of things. One is, what have we learned recently? And in March, some of his Senate testimony in 1975 was declassified for the first time.
Oh.
And in there, what we learned was just how closely he had integrated his own intelligence operations, staffing his own operations within the CIA with people brought in or processed, exiles from the Soviet Union processed by the Israelis. So his role in coordinating with Israel was undoubted, throughout the 1960s. And Israel was in conflict with the Kennedy administration in the summer of 1963 over their secret nuclear program. And this led to almost not a break in relations, but David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, resigned. It was a bit of a crisis for the Israeli government because Kennedy was pushing for on-site inspections.
That's right.
So, and that was something the Israelis didn't want because they had a secret plan to create a secret nuclear facility where they were trying to build nuclear weapons, which eventually they did.
Of course they
did. By 1969, they had obtained a nuclear weapon.
You could make a case that was also at the cost of some American lives. With the Silkwood, I think it was called the Silkwood case. I'm sure you're more familiar with that than I am. But I know that there were people who were trying to expose this story who lost their lives. About the stealing of plutonium, if I have that correctly. I don't know if you know who Daniel Sheehan is.
Faust, I think you're confusing 2 different things.
Oh yeah, tell me.
So Karen Silkwood was a whistleblower in a nuclear plant, but that didn't have anything to do with another nuclear plant where fissile material was diverted or stolen by Israeli agents in 1968. That was a key part of the Israel's ability to build a bomb, was that they had obtained fissile material, which is hard to obtain. It was tightly controlled for understandable reasons, and so that was part of their drive for the bomb. So, did Angleton know about that? I mean, his defenders sometimes denied it, sometimes they didn't. I spoke with a guy when I was writing my book about Angleton. I spoke with a guy who had worked for him, who had been the station chief in Tel Aviv. I didn't speak to him. I spoke with his son. And the son, John Haddon Jr., had interviewed his father extensively about his time working for Angleton. And then so John Haddon Jr. gave me a lot of material that his father had collected, because his father had very mixed feelings about Angleton. He worked for him and admired him, but also felt he was very manipulative and deceptive. And John Haddon Sr. came to the conclusion that Angleton had indeed helped the Israelis get the bomb, and had arrayed a lot of evidence, which he shared with me and which I reported in my book, The Ghost. I thought it was a pretty convincing case that Angleton had certainly enabled it, I would say. So,
do you think the secrets that Angleton was keeping from Kennedy played a role in getting him killed? JFK, of course, I mean.
Well, what we learned about Angleton in the most recent releases was his testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 was declassified. And for the first time, we learned that Angleton had lied about what he knew about Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
And so that was significant. I mean, it wasn't a big lie. Angleton knew that Oswald was under male surveillance, because Angleton had put his name on the list of people whose letters were to be opened. So when he said he didn't know about that, he was lying. Mm-hmm. Now, is he lying about a plot to kill the president? Well, the fact that they hid that for 60 years, it's certainly, they were certainly being furtive about it. They were certainly being, clandestine about it. And, the evidence has mounted over the years that Angleton or somebody around him, probably him, or somebody he designated, was running an operation involving Oswald. The idea that Lee Harvey Oswald just kind of wandered through the American landscape and then shot the president, that's crazy. He was very well known. He was a very well known character at the top of the CIA throughout Kennedy's presidency.
Right.
So, I think, I mean, people say, oh, do you have a smoking gun? No, I don't. Angleton's a plausible suspect in Kennedy's death. That's about the most you could say with, any kind of confidence. But that's plenty when you think about it. And his actions around Oswald are very deceptive. They're very hard to account for. And the possibility that, he was running an operation to, provoke an invasion with Cuba, to, it's certainly in the realm of possibility. And, don't forget, James Angleton ran assassination operations.
That's right.
Peter Wright was one of the top officials in British intelligence. And in his book, he told the story of meeting with Bill Harvey and Jim Angleton. And they said, we want to do a job on Castro. What can you advise us? How would you guys do it?
Right.
And, he said that they were straight up planning an assassination. So these were lethal men, let's put it that way.
Yes. And my God, they plotted more ways to kill Castro than I think anyone can even imagine. Most people, anyway. Just every which way they were willing to give it a whirl. That's what I've learned in the last 2 years. It's like, wow, they were going to do that as well. It's crazy. Just about about Oswald and the fact that he was going to act as this courier for Castro, and they were developing this bioweapon, and that was going to cause turbo cancer, and they convinced all these doctors,
who said that?
Oh my God! So there's been a bunch of recent, both podcasts, and then I've been kind of reading up on what I'm learning. But they Lee Harvey Oswald's I don't know if you want to call her his mistress, but it was one of the doctors who were working with Mary Sherman. So Faust. Yeah.
I spent some time with Judith Baker.
Okay, yeah. That's who I'm referring to. She's out there.
I mean, she says a lot of things that I couldn't confirm.
Yeah.
And when I tried to confirm them, like, okay, that's what happened to you, so let me ask you this and that question. I mean, she shut me down.
Yeah.
She did not want to be fact-checked, and so I can't put any credence in anything she says. I
Right.
mean, it might be true, but I have no assurance that it is, and there's good reason to believe that it isn't. So her story, I just kind of take off the table. I can't say that that happened, and she has not made herself credible to me in a way
Right.
where I would say, yeah, that's what happened with Oswald. Whereas the stuff I'm telling you about, Angleton was spying on him, you can take that to the bank,
Right.
right? That's there's no two ways about it.
Yeah, I mean, she's probably the weakest link in that whole story, even with her testimony, and she's only recently started coming out. She wrote a book apparently, but Dr. Mary Sherman, and then you have David Ferrie and all these characters, who were reportedly very busy working to, quote, save the world, and they convinced these doctors, some of them incredibly, brilliant, and they were working on cures for cancer, and they said, listen, we want to save the world. We need you to help us. We have to take Castro out, and it has to look like natural causes. So we need you to help us because we don't want a nuclear war with Russia. And so they got all these incredible people to work in this laboratory, which was in New Orleans, I believe. And apparently, it's just for me, I do a lot of research on people like Lee Harvey Oswald, Timothy McVeigh, and you see how these things line up: the double agent, the patsy, the way they use these poor guys, and then hang them out to dry. So it doesn't surprise me at all what I learned about, this bioweapon they were developing, and the fact that, or the alleged fact that Lee was going to be the one who gave it to someone to give to Castro. I don't know. That's, again, very alleged.
Again, the evidence for that chain of events.
Yeah.
Can we put that into what's known about the chronology of Oswald's life? Because we know a lot about Oswald's life.
Right.
And it's like, when I tried to do that, I couldn't make it work to my own satisfaction.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I mean, that
Maybe
said,
one day. Yeah.
the milieu of New Orleans, where Oswald clearly was mixing with people like David Ferrie, and was part of the events that led to the assassination, and was also very much a CIA and organized crime milieu. So yeah, the events in New Orleans are a real part of the story. But you tell me, Faust, where do you see the causes of the assassination emanating from?
Oh my God, there's just I think it's virtually impossible to put your finger on any single issue because there were so many, and they were all mounting,
Right.
But that's a great question. But I don't know if anyone who really dives into this, and you tell me if you agree with me, can say that there was certainly one, primary reason. Maybe there was, but it seems to me like there was at least a dozen, maybe two, that could have been,
I'll tell you how I think of it. People say, Jeff, who killed Kennedy? And I say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And they say, well, come on, everybody knows. You got a theory? No, I don't really have a theory. I mean, I got a lot of evidence, and it's hard to read. The official story, that's not true. That's not what happened. We have enough evidence to know that. But what did happen? It's very complicated crime scene, tainted by bad evidence and misconduct and a lot of malfeasance, bad testimony, bad evidence. But if you look at all of it and just kind of step back, I think you have to say the most likely explanation for this baffling and bloody series of events, is that the president was ambushed by his enemies who had the ability to make it look like something else and to dump the blame onto this guy Oswald, who probably knew something about what was going on and was therefore had to be eliminated. That seems like the most commonsensical explanation. But yeah, you know, could you put somebody in a court of law and say we're going to convict you beyond a reasonable doubt? You know, with a jury of 12 peers? No way.
Yeah, no. They're really good at that whole plausible deniability thing.
Yeah, right. No, and don't forget, you know, these types of things are organized with plausible deniability you know, involved, so that every step of the way you can say you had nothing to do with it.
Right.
And so, you know, after all these years, and we've learned a whole lot thanks to Oliver Stone and laws and investigations and a lot of good books and a lot of bad books. You know, we've really, you know, come a long way to, you know, towards the getting the totality of the evidence, and that's what it tells us, is the president was killed by his enemies.
Yeah.
So in his own government, I think
Right.
that's, you know, that's fair to say. You know, I see a lot of online speculation about Angleton, the Israelis killed. You know, I mean, Angleton was very close with the Israelis, but
Right.
if there was a plot against the president, it emanated from his own government. I mean, Israel might have approved of it, they might have liked the idea, but that doesn't mean that they caused it.
No.
You know, and you talk about, you know, you can't point to one person. It seems more like there was a consensus that this story that one guy killed the president for no reason, like there was a consensus that that's what happened, and that's
Right.
what the American people were going to be told from day one.
Right.
And that was not one person telling that. That was Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, Allen Dulles. You know, so it wasn't that there was one person, you know, orchestrating the cover-up. There was a consensus that
Absolutely.
this was not going to be talked about, you know. And it's taken a long time to, you know, break through. And, you know, we still don't have.
No, we don't. You know, it's you know, when I make a video about JFK, YouTube will still post the Wikipedia version of events as context below my video. You know, like Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm just like, you know, when are we going to stop? When are they going to give it up? Like, just stop the nonsense narrative that they've been feeding us for how many decades now? It's mind blowing. They still do it. You know, I just made a video a couple months ago, and on the bottom of the video it says, you know, here's what happened in the JFK assassination. Don't listen to what this guy's saying.
And you know what I love about the Wikipedia thing is, you know, you can actually tell that they're very nervous about what they're saying, because in there they say Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president. They don't even say allegedly, right? Which, you know, if I'm a journalist, when we write a story about somebody who's accused of murder but they're not convicted, you say alleged. And even if it's like obvious that they're the killer, you know, you still say alleged, because you don't have the court of law definition.
It's a great
And
point.
so they won't even do that.
No.
Because if they even say alleged, then they know that a lot of people say it's more than alleged, he didn't do it. So they won't even allow that one word in.
Yeah.
You know, because if they say alleged, we get our foot in the door and we win the argument.
Right. My God, that's a great point. It makes so much sense. I mean, if I'm remembering events correctly, he was never even charged with shooting the president. He was dead before that, wasn't he? He was only charged with killing Tippit before they knocked him off.
I think that they were preparing the charge, but he had actually not been charged.
Not officially, no.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because of what you just said. You know, it's what says it in no, you know, completely unambiguously that he's the one who did it. My God, man. Wikipedia.
No, and it was very telling. You know, one of the early critics of the Warren Commission, Mark Lane, was a left-wing lawyer from New York. And when they were forming the Warren Commission, he went to Earl Warren and said, look, Oswald's the defendant in this case. He has a right to counsel. You know, like, he's not here, but his interests, there should be somebody to defend his interests, just as in a normal adversarial, you know, court proceeding. Mm-hmm. No, they didn't want that. They wanted to convict that man, and they didn't want a lawyer in the way.
No, especially one like Mark Lane, who really was just I mean, the man was making documentaries that, ended up at least airing or being produced 2-3 years after I think it was like 67 was one of the first ones that came out, and just all this eyewitness testimony. I watch it and I'm like, it's mind blowing. All these people saying things that are completely counter to the narrative that we've been told, and it's all there in this documentary. Like all these people saying, well, I clearly heard a shot on the grassy knoll, but the FBI told me that was impossible, so I guess I misheard. I'm like, no, you didn't mishear. You heard it right, man. Don't let the FBI tell you. But it's just wild, man. But Mark Lane is, if you haven't read Mark Lane's books, those are, if you're interested in JFK, he's a fantastic author. He's been, long time now. But my other question for you, Jeff, is, so, I love this. You said this. You said, if you want to understand what happened to Kennedy, you have to look at what changed after he died, right? And I mean, he wanted to end the Cold War. He wanted to pull out of Vietnam, and he wanted to dismantle the CIA for a lot of reasons. And instead, this seems to be the ongoing themes for America now. We have constant foreign regime change, forever wars. We have a surveillance empire. And, we're talking about taking out, like, just how deep do you think that whole thing goes? And like the effects that it's had on America in our foreign policy since the death of Kennedy?
I think we see the effect today, right? Especially Kennedy in his last year. People say, "Oh, Kennedy was no great liberal," or if you look at the arc of his presidency, when he starts, he's pretty conventional Cold Warrior, but he's a different president by 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the effect on him, that he might have had to order a nuclear attack that killed 10 million people. He was a human being who had to think about that, because he was close to having to do that. And that, I mean, it scared the Jesus out of him, as it should have. Nobody should be in that position. And for Kennedy, what was especially confounding about it was, this wasn't about the great struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This was about an unimportant country, strategically, economically, culturally. I mean, fine, it's a nice neighbor to the United States, right, but it's not an important country, not like France or Russia, other great powers of the world. And yet they were going to go to war, and so that had a big effect on Kennedy. And in June of '63, here in Washington, D.C., he gives his famous speech at American University, which everybody should watch if you want to understand what we've lost. And in there, he talked about a strategy for peace. And I think that's what we've lost, in a word. This country doesn't have a strategy for peace. No. We're kind of geared for war. And we have been for the entire 21st century, and maybe before that. And it's the loss of that vision of somebody who said, we're going to make sure that we don't go to war and that we don't sponsor wars. That's going to be our mission. Mm. And now we're kind of the opposite. I said, we're geared for war. We're spending huge amounts of money. We're not sending our children, but we're consigning other people's children to war at a huge cost. And Ukraine and Gaza are both wars that could have been prevented by diplomacy. And this is not saying anything about Putin or Israel or anything like that. If you look at those conflicts, the United States had the ability to make sure that there was not war there. Now, would we have to have, had something that wasn't perfectly to our liking? Sure. Yeah, probably. And that was part of Kennedy's message, was we have to look at things from the other guy's point of view so that we can really have a genuine peace. And in the speech, and this is where the Kennedy is a radical voice these days. He says, we do not want a Pax Americana. Okay, we don't want to enforce our vision of the world at the force of arms. And right now, we're really kind of in the grips of, we have to, have a Pax Americana. Now, Trump is a new variation on that, but is he really a break from that?
It's not proving to be much of a break.
That he is. The problem certainly goes deeper than any one man or one party. as a society, we're almost geared for war. So,
Yeah.
and we'd be better off, right? We'd have more money, right? We'd cause less mayhem. People wouldn't hate us. So it seems commonsensical, but we've lost it.
Yeah.
And the forces that oppose Kennedy and are in favor of this system, they were never held accountable for what happened in Dallas, right? And that was a catastrophic intelligence failure.
God.
If you believe Oswald killed the president, it was a catastrophic intelligence failure.
Right.
And if you don't believe it, it was something worse.
That's right.
But we've never had that. We had the Warren Commission, which said, "Oh, it's all in that one mad guy, so everything's fine."
Right.
That's worn off now, and part of why Trump has prevailed. And I'm not a fan of the president in most regards, but is he said that it's a lie.
Right.
You're lying to us, and he's stuck with it, and he's kind of delivered on the JFK files. We've learned a whole lot thanks to Trump's order, and we're going to learn a whole lot more as these new records are digested. So, but in terms of what we've lost, that's we don't have leaders who have Kennedy's vision.
No.
So
Yeah.
Understanding how Kennedy lost and what was the power, the constellation of power that led to that disaster and cover up. That's what people need to understand how do we get out of the situation we're in today, where we're locked in these forever wars. And it's like, why are we doing this?
Right. The only person who I heard speaking about adopting his uncle's, foreign policy and leading the world, going back to using, the American might as a role model, maybe not actually going back, but becoming what we always could have been. Bobby Kennedy Jr., when he was running for president before he sided and got in with the Trump administration, he was talking about that. But you really don't hear, I was a fan of Bobby before he got into politics for a lot of the great work he was doing. I probably was a bigger fan of him before he got into politics, because now, when you roll around with pigs, you're going to get money.
His environmental work.
Yes, some of his environmental work and his championing of some of the parents who have kids who were injured from certain medical mandatory procedures that happen in our country, with very little accountability or, responsibility by the manufacturers and all that. And he was ostracized by his family for that stance. But I always admired him that he was willing to stick his neck on the chopping block for parents who were dealing with this catastrophic damage in their child. And he had become a bit of a Mercury, expert when he was trying to clean up the rivers. And so they were like, if you're interested in Mercury, look at these, Anyway, long story short, he's the only one who even remotely started to talk about we need to lead the world in peace. You didn't even hear anyone else even mention it. And I don't know how much it's worth even when they do, because they end up manipulated into what we're seeing even today.
Yeah, and I think that's also another point is that this system, the change in presidents doesn't make much difference, and the president might come in and talk a good game. Barack Obama, constitutional lawyer, but next thing you know, he's running Guantanamo. It's like they figure the only way to get along is to do what these guys want. And unfortunately, that is true. That the presidents need the CIA more than the CIA needs the president.
Yeah,
and that's how, on the JFK files, that's what happened the first time around with Trump. It was like, the CIA came to him and said, you got to withhold this stuff. Trump said, fine. It was like he didn't want to pick a fight with them.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about MKUltra. So in 1953, a U.S. biowarfare scientist, we were told, fell out of a 13th story hotel window. And that was after being secretly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues. So my question is, Do you believe the CIA unalived Frank Olson, as they say today, unalive? That's how we keep the algorithms.
Yeah, I wrote about the Frank Olson story in my biography of Angleton because Angleton was very involved in the creation of MKUltra and in 1953, and as part of that, the Army was conducting tests with LSD. And so when MKUltra got going, they were trying to do a whole bunch of different things. One was that there were U.S. prisoners of war in Korea who were going on TV and saying, we were using biowarfare, captured American POWs. So one thing was, well, could you give somebody a pill so that they would forget everything they had done and they couldn't testify against us? Another one was, if you had a Korean prisoner of war, could you give them something, a truth serum, So there were all these different ideas, and there was this strange chemical LSD that they had these properties that no one, had ever experienced before. So they were doing that, and as part of that, one of the scientists who worked on this program, they took LSD themselves because they wanted to understand its effects and how to do it. And so Frank Olson was in that group, and there's one common misconception that he was unwittingly dosed. He may have been, but other times he, like the other scientists,
he took it himself.
Took the LSD to try and figure it out. But what became clear in Olson's case was he started to have misgivings about what was going on. And he was doing highly classified work, and his son certainly came to believe, and there's circumstantial evidence to support, that he knew that they were experimenting on human subjects with the LSD. And he wanted to withdraw from the program. He just wanted to quit. So he was coming under a lot of pressure from his colleagues who were afraid that he would quit and start talking about what he knew. So that's when they were accompanying him to New York. And when he was in New York, he fell from the window. I think it's much more likely that he was thrown from the window.
Right. I
think what happened was he was trying to leave the hotel room, and a brawl ensued, and in the brawl he was thrown out the window.
Wow.
Because he was considered a security threat.
Yeah.
The interesting part of the story, which I tell in the book, is he goes out the window. The guy who's it was a 10th floor room. The guy who's in the room with him is a CIA psychologist.
Oh.
Okay, so the CIA has to make sure that the NYPD, which is investigating a dead guy on 8th Avenue, doesn't go up there and discover that there's a CIA psychologist there.
Wow.
So what do? They send one of their cleanup men, a guy named James McCord. And that was the future Watergate burglar. And he went to New York and he backstopped the psychologist CIA file so that if somebody called, it would say that he was some, professor, not that he worked for the CIA. So
wow.
James McCord cleaned up the Frank Olson story, the Frank Olson murder, really, on behalf of the CIA.
Wow. Fascinating. So Alan Dulles, I mean, he's one of the people who built the CIA's empire. And,
yes.
Very much responsible for engineering coups, launched, an untold amount of different black ops programs. And basically, I would make the argument that he understood the power of secrecy and turned it into strategy, right? And when Kennedy fired him, it looked like this whole empire might crack, but new directors came and went. One man on the inside carried the torch the whole time, right? And so my question for you is, who was Richard Helms, and how did he become like this? I mean, you could say he was like one of the gatekeepers of the shadow state.
Yeah, gatekeeper of the shadow state. So, James Angleton, very creative, reclusive. He's kind of the spy as intellectual, very brainy, complex theories, figuring things out, devious, sinister, and all that. Dick Helms is the spy as a bureaucrat. He's bland. He's affable. He has a wide range of friends. He's soft-spoken. He's never gets mad. Very composed, very poised, but also, very cagey. And he earns this reputation as the man who kept the secrets. So he's very straight-laced, and makes his way by a very careful administrator, very fair, inspired a lot of loyalty among the men he worked for, but a creative covert operator, not as flamboyant as Dulles perhaps, wouldn't take as big risks, but probably more effective because of that. Dick Helms's big break was the Bay of Pigs, which was a disaster for the agency, but very good for Helms. When they were planning the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1959 and 1960, right? The idea is we got to get in there and throw out this guy Castro because he's a communist and he's establishing a one-party state here, and he's saying very bad things, criticizing the U.S. in Latin America. So we got to get rid of him.
Right.
And so they used the same plan that they used in Guatemala in 1954, which is on the diplomacy, you isolate them and denounce them as outside the community, the target government, outside the community of peaceful nations. Internally, you fund all of the opposition, whatever. You spread money around and get them to criticize the incumbent power. You use local media to spread disinformation. And then you have a paramilitary force that somehow poses a threat to the regime, and the U.S. comes in and rescues them, or they prevail over the target government. So that was the Guatemala formula, and they tried to use it in Cuba. Well, Che Guevara had been a medical student in Guatemala in 1954. He saw the whole thing of how they did it, and he understood exactly how they had succeeded. So 5 years later, he's compadres here with Fidel. They've just taken power in Cuba. They know what's coming.
Right.
They know the CIA game plan, and so they just head him off at every turn.
Yeah.
And so when they finally launched the invasion, it's a total disaster. Well, when they were organizing that whole thing inside the CIA, Dick Helms said, "This isn't going to work." But he said it very softly. He didn't criticize anybody. He was a very senior guy already, and he was a effective covert operator. But he said, "I'm not going to hands off." And there's a famous story in the CIA literature. They turn to Dick and they say, "Dick, what do you think of our great plan?" And they said, Helms didn't say anything. He just studied his fingernails. Anyway, when the whole thing went south, ended disastrously, he was vindicated. It was like, we should have been more careful. It was a stupid plan. It was never going to work. We were arrogant. And so that was how Helms got ahead. Well, but he was very much a cold warrior, and he was not happy with the way Kennedy handled Cuba, not at all.
Yeah.
So, but an inoffensive, charming, cagey, spy.
Right.
Spymaster. Yeah.
Spymaster. Yeah, that's the right word. So, 1972, very, very important year for American history. You have the Watergate scandal, which is now these days largely forgotten, and our young people probably would have to guess at what Watergate could possibly mean.
Right.
And on the surface, we learned it was about a burglary, but in Scorpion's Dance, you reveal a hidden war between Richard Nixon and the intelligence machine that he thought that he was in control of. And it sounds like JFK's assassination was the CIA surviving a president who challenged it, right? And Watergate was the CIA taking down a president who was a little too close to everything. What would you say to that?
I read it a little differently. I mean, I think that what you're right about is the JFK story is a big deal between Richard Nixon and Richard Helms.
Yeah.
Because Nixon doesn't believe the official story, and Nixon believes the CIA was involved. But, the idea Richard Helms really liked Nixon. And the idea that the CIA under Helms was hostile to Nixon, I didn't
Yeah.
find that. Helms was actually one of the most loyal people to Nixon, even when his own cabinet was saying, this invasion of Cambodia is nuts. Helms said, go for it, go for it, go for it. So he was very much a hawk and a cold warrior. But when the burglars were arrested, the 7 men who, 6 of them had connections to the CIA. And
Right.
the truth was that really, and this story I tell in Scorpion's Dance, Helms had basically supplied the burglars to Nixon. Nixon was raging. He wanted somebody to go after Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, which showed that kind of the deception behind the Vietnam War.
Right.
A wake-up call for America. You talk about,
Right.
1972 as a pivotal year, when the scope of the deception that enabled the Vietnam War, and that it had gone on for years,
My God.
and that there were lots of people in the government who knew that it was a disaster and a bad idea, and nobody said anything. That was a revelation to people. Well, it drove Nixon crazy because it was a national security secret that he wanted to keep. So he wants a burglar. He wants a dirty tricks guy. And Helms says, well, I know this guy Howard Hunt. He'll do the job for you. And Hunt was very much like Nixon. He was an abrasive, cold warrior,
Right.
Aggressive, dirty tricks guy, no holds barred. So Hunt got along great with Nixon. It was just that he got caught. Then when he got caught, Nixon expected, well, hey, you gave me these guys, so help me get out of this.
Right.
That was not Dick Helms. No, Dick Helms let him twist slowly in the wind because Dick Helms was going to save Dick Helms
That's
and
right.
the CIA, and that's what happened. So to me, it was less that they intentionally brought Nixon down, which then they protected their own game and left Nixon at the mercy of his enemies. They did not come to his rescue the way they would have come to the rescue of another president. But I think that part is fair.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like Richard Nixon was probably more informed about what actually happened to JFK than many of the other people who have taken office. I mean, that's from my research, I would guess that, he would be someone who they would let him twist in the wind, as you said, but at the same time, they weren't going to take too many chances with him. Once he's out, they knew that he's not going to say too much because he would end up implicating the knowledge that he has or had. I don't know. That's kind of I definitely think that Dick knew a lot.
I think, though, that, Helms certainly supported Nixon's desire to centralize intelligence in the White House. I think Helms thought that that would increase his own power, and I do think it's significant. When I was doing the book, the Scorpion's Dance book, I was looking, what did Nixon say about the Warren Commission? Nixon never endorsed the Warren Commission. That was not his style. He knew too much to do that. Say what you want about Nixon. He was very smart about the workings of power.
Yeah.
And, the idea that he was going to buy this story of, the lone gunman.
Yeah.
No, Dick Nixon was way too canny for that.
Yeah. I think so. And I definitely agree with you there. Here's a question for you. In 2003, you sued the CIA, and I'm wondering how that went.
It's true. 2003, I sued the CIA for the records of a CIA officer named George Joannides, who was involved in the JFK story in several interesting ways. It was a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, and seeking the records of this Joannides, who was a career officer who served in Miami in 1963 when his paid agents had contact with Oswald. And in 1978, when he served as the CIA's liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassination. So he had 2 different roles. Very interesting character. And anything that he was doing in those 2 periods was, related to the assassination. So I filed a lawsuit. The CIA, about a year later, sent me a little package of about 100 pages and said, thank you, goodbye.
Yeah.
So I said, this is, I know there's way more. You have
Right.
way more than this. And so I appealed, and I said, I had a good lawyer, and I said, well, we asked for these searches, but you need to go look in X, Y, and Z places. And my lawyer kind of knew how the CIA was organized. And there's this archive and that collection. And, and there's a real, it takes real research, but it is knowable. And so, the CIA said, get lost. So we appealed, and we won the appeal.
Nice.
So the CIA had to go back and do all these additional searches. And that took until 2007.
Wow.
And in 2007, or actually I won. And in 2008, I got about 500 more pages from the Joe Anides personnel file. And we learned a whole lot more about him and his involvement in the events of 1963 and 1978. So he was, his secret agents were generating propaganda around Oswald before the assassination and after the assassination.
Wow.
And he stonewalled investigators in 1978. So in the course of this lawsuit, I had a lot of dealings with the CIA lawyers in court and in meetings. We tried mediation, and they were incredibly arrogant. I mean, they were so offended that that I was doing this. And we finally had one meeting. We were trying to settle it. The thing dragged on for years. I was like,
yeah, I
screw
heard
it,
it's 20 years almost.
and,
It's crazy.
and we go to this meeting, and these people are like, I mean, they won't even shake my hand. And I said, look.
God.
I said, I'm a taxpayer and I'm operating within the law. Don't be offended by this. You work for me. Let's get this done. And they were like, how dare you talk to us like that? I was like, let's get down to business, okay? Yeah. Just cut the attitude. So the arrogance was very telling. It was like, how could you possibly question us?
Yeah.
And so people are sick of that, It's
totally. It's like at some point, we have to decide what kind of country we want to be, one that condones secrets or one that confronts them. And I'm not talking about the, national security stuff. I'm talking about the truth that's been well hidden, because there are consequences to letting the truth die in the dark. More as well as or more than anyone. Those consequences, we see them every day, But so you've spent your career chasing the truth, and and in many ways you've forced the government to own up to its own history. And so for people listening who feel kind of overwhelmed by how deep and dark this rabbit hole and this web of deception goes, what's your advice for those who still they want to live in truth and they want to help shape a future that's more honest than the past? What can they do?
Well, you got to educate yourself, and and that's stay away from the conspiracy theories. Don't educate yourself through social media because it's very distorted. But there's important stories to be learned, and if there's a hope, it's that the people will be educated enough and that influence will be felt enough that the people in power will, recognize it, and that we can have leaders. So is it a dark moment? Yeah, but on the other hand, I feel like because of political pressure that was brought by people like me, Trump reversed himself and did the right thing. Right. We got leadership from people like Robert Kennedy Jr., who said these records should be made public, and it made a difference. And we got a lot, and we are going to learn more. Now, is the truth going to set us free in the next election cycle? No. But if you educate yourself and you talk about this with people around you, and you can feel good about it. And if you're interested in kind of what I'm saying, this is what we do at JFK Facts on Substack. And we don't do culture war. We come from a wide variety of opinion, from right to left and center. We don't argue about that stuff. We talk about what's the story with President Kennedy? What's to learn from this? What do we learn from the new files? And so there is a community of people who are seeking the truth and who are not divided. It is possible to find that. So, I've had the very happy experience of working with Congresswoman Luna from Florida, who's very conservative, not like me. I'm pretty
Very
liberal.
cute.
She's a pleasure to work with. She's not cowed by the CIA. She's very effective. She's very sharp. So like, could we sit around and argue about the things we disagree on? Yeah, we could.
Yeah.
It's a lot more fun to work on something that we can do together and we can get things done. So, it is a hard time, but it is possible. I think you got to do it in your circle. You can't do it on social media. You got to do it with people. You got to talk to people. And that's where you can find that solidarity and commitment and the belief that truth does make a difference. And so that's how I hang in there.
I love that. I mean, I think that, social media does present an opportunity to reach a lot of people. The problem is conspiracy theories, they're just like the way the news outlets use, these outrage headlines and all this fear and death, and they know that they'll get people to click and look. You have conspiracy theories, using the same tactics on social media. So you have to be wary. But I do believe that, podcasts have become very, very important to the process of information sharing in this country, particularly with legacy media.
And there's an important distinction, because here on a podcast, we're having a conversation,
Right.
two guys, and like we're adjusting our views and speaking at length. We can connect as people and have a conversation. If we were sitting here firing 140 word tidbits at each other, we'd probably be at each other's throats.
Yeah,
And
it wouldn't
like
take long.
and it's like, this is a much more humane medium, and it's good because it's a low cost medium too, right? To have a video production, that's very expensive. Here we've got a couple of laptops. You've got a nice rig. I've got a Mac. And off we go. So that is, maybe that's the formula. People want to know what to do. Podcasts, not social media.
Right.
Maybe that's the formula.
Source your information wisely, right? That's wise words for anyone, whether you're looking at an author or a podcast. I think that's, but I agree 110%. Education is key. It's very difficult for people to try to map, where they want to go when they really have been misled about the road they took to get here, and they're seeing everything that's going on, and they're like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you know where you came from, it begins to make a lot of sense. Not so much in a great way, but in a kind of like, oh my God, kind of way. So that's why, I've become very passionate about history, and trying to kind of not wake people up, but educate, and enlighten in a way that you're just not going to find in academia because of the control structures in place. And that's why, you're people like you who spend years, fighting and digging and researching and interviewing and just doing incredible work. I think it's so important, especially in this country, which we still call the land of the free, to be able to have this freedom and communication is so vital. So thank you for all the work you've done, all the incredible work you've done, and for taking some time to hang out with me and share some wisdom and knowledge.
Well, thanks for having me, Faust. It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to have a nice conversation.
Absolutely.
So let's do it again.
We'll have to, because I have a whole nother set of questions that I want to get into. But tell everyone where to find you, what your latest book is, and so that I'm sure they're going to want to keep tabs.
Yeah, so you can find my JFK journalism at jfkfacts.substack.com. And you can find my books on Amazon. My CIA books are Our Man in Mexico, and The Ghost about James Angleton, and Scorpion's Dance. It's kind of a trilogy of spies. I'm associated with the Mary Farrell Foundation, which hosts the largest online collection of JFK, RFK, and MLK assassination records, searchable. And that's a great place for anybody who wants to educate themselves. And you don't need to know anything. And we don't push conspiracy theories at you. We explain kind of what the best information out there is, what have been learned over the years, and you can take a look and look at the original sources yourself and really find. So that's really for people who are looking to get going in these subjects and really master them instead of just repeating cliches or memes on social media. That's a great place. That's a great place to go. So that's where people can find me on Twitter at Jefferson Morley, and I always take questions, tips. If people have an idea, I'm open to that.
Nice.
I think that the more exposure, the more conversation we have about this, the better off we are as a country.
100%. I agree, my friend. For everyone who stayed with us, thank you so much for hanging out. If you enjoyed this podcast, please drop us a review on Spotify, write us a couple comments. All these things go very far in helping us spread the word and overcome some of the algorithmic hindrances we've hit with the subject matter we love to tackle. So thank you to everyone. If you liked it, please share it with a friend. Jeff, thank you so much, brother. I appreciate your time very much. We'll have to do it again, man. I'll get a bunch of more questions for you, and we'll have another session. It'd be great.
Thanks, Fausto. I look forward to it.
Thank you, brother. You take care.